Hello and welcome to Mind, Body, Sleep, the podcast for anyone out there who wants to understand and recover from insomnia using a holistic perspective. I'm Beth, Kendall, your host. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the episode. It is a glorious day here in Minnesota. I think it's in the 50s, and I'm recording this at the tail end of February, so I am not complaining. In fact, I'm headed to the River Dog Park right after I record this episode, which is pretty up there in terms of my favorite things to do. But I am excited about today's topic because it centers on the concept of trust. And I think this is a really meaningful word when we're talking about insomnia. The first thing I'm going to talk about today is the role of trust and how I see it play out in the experience of insomnia. Next, I'm going to talk about how I help people reconnect to their trust. Lastly, I'm going to share what the definition of insomnia recovery is to me and how trust factors into that. So let's first look at the definition of trust according to the Webster Dictionary. Trust is a firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. Well, that sounds pretty good, but this is really such an expansive topic because trust is a central part of all human relationships, including our relationship with sleep. Insomnia, in my opinion, isn't just a fear of not sleeping. It's a loss of faith or trust in the body's own ability to sleep. In fact, this may be the bigger part of the picture for a lot of people, because I don't think you could have insomnia if you trusted this aspect of your biology. So trust and fear are two sides of the same coin when we're talking about insomnia. We lose faith in our own ability to sleep and develop a fear of not sleeping. Trust is among the most fundamental factors of our human existence because it encompasses almost every aspect of our being. The level of trust we have in ourselves, in the other people, and in the world determines every action we take. If I were to dig a little further into the role of trust in the context of insomnia, the way I usually see this play out for people is typically they experience some sort of sleep disruption due to whatever reason in life. And at this point in time, there is a questioning of sleep or a difference in the way we pay attention to it. Maybe there's the thought that something is wrong with my sleep, or shouldn't I be sleeping better by now? And what we don't often realize is that we are being subconsciously bombarded everywhere to put a tremendous amount of emphasis on sleep. And this emphasis is driven by a very lucrative sleep industry. So most of that messaging around sleep is heavily weighted in fear. And this can prime the brain for the development of some sleep anxiety, which we're seeing everywhere. So this is the point in time where a little seed of doubt gets planted in the mind about our own ability to sleep. And from that moment, our relationship to sleep starts to change. We start going down the rabbit holes of fixing sleep. We start doing things we never used to do for sleep. We start researching sleep. And all the while, our trust gets lost, right? We slowly get knocked out of our knowingness around sleep. And then before you know it, there's this conditioned alarm bell going off in your brain at night, keeping you from being able to fall asleep. And by that time, it can feel pretty hard to trust your own ability to sleep when your experience tells you otherwise, which is why It truly does feel like you have a broken brain when you're going through insomnia. Now, experiencing this loss of trust isn't much different than a loss of trust in any other area of life. Having gone through chronic illness, I know what it's like to live in a body that you feel has betrayed you. And who among us hasn't experienced the betrayal of another human on some level and the lasting effects of that betrayal? It isn't easy to trust something that has betrayed you, and this is normal. It's your survival system kicking in to protect you from the painful emotions of another betrayal. If I were to define trust as it pertains to the ability to sleep, I would describe it as a deep unconscious knowing. A knowing so innate that you wouldn't think to even question it or cultivate it. If you ask someone without insomnia how they trust their sleep, they wouldn't understand the question because that knowingness is unconscious. It's as natural as breathing or pumping blood. We don't really need trust to do those things because we just know they happen all on their own. But with insomnia, we get knocked out of this knowingness. Something happens along the way that changes how we interact with sleep, which leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about today, which is how I help people reconnect to that trust or knowingness. A lot of what I'm saying right now probably makes sense to you, but you don't really feel it, right? Maybe you held that knowingness in the past, but trust doesn't feel possible right now because it's not your current lived experience. And that's okay. It's exactly what I would expect you to feel if you're listening to this podcast. I don't think you can really force this reconnection. We can only create space for it to happen. I view reconnecting to that knowingness almost as a remembrance. And what I do in my program is create an environment for that to happen. And there are several ways that I do that. But the first thing I do is give people the proper education they need to understand what their brains are doing and why, how they even ended up with insomnia in the first place. The importance of this cannot be overstated because once you have this understanding, you'll realize very quickly that there's nothing wrong with your ability to sleep. You've just got this overzealous alarm bell going off in your brain. But even bigger than the alarm bell, which is something we focus on as well, is the relationship we have with sleep that is creating the alarm bell in the first place. Another thing I do is help people shift out of the orientation of fixing sleep and into the orientation of trusting sleep. These two orientations have vastly different focuses. One is all about what you don't want, and the other is all about what you do. So, what does this even mean? Well, let me give you an example of how this understanding came to be from my own experience with chronic illness. For most of my recovery journey with chronic Lyme, I was focused almost entirely on fixing my health. My life and my focus were on fixing the perceived problem, which was Lyme. And to some degree, you have to do this to understand what you're dealing with. So I read every study ever done on Lyme and everything that comes with that, because Lyme is really the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes, in my opinion. So this kept me busy for literally years. But the entirety of my relationship with illness was focused on fixing the problem. And I stayed in this orientation for a very long time. If you want to hear more about my story, you can go back to episodes 3 and 4, which are called Dancing with Insomnia. So eventually, I reached the point where I had a significant realization that my approach to chronic illness wasn't really working. The needle wasn't moving in terms of better health, and I somehow knew there had to be a better way, or at least a different way. At that point, a series of serendipitous events occurred that changed the GPS of my recovery. I shifted from solely focusing on fixing my health to actively creating my health. And this took me out of the energy of the problem and into the energy of the solution. So my intention went through a major transformation. Fixing health and creating health are two very different orientations. One felt very heavy to me, and the other felt hopeful. Intention is ultimately the main driver of our outcomes, because you can have two people doing the exact same thing, but have completely different outcomes based on their intention. It's the same for insomnia. Fixing sleep, which doesn't work anyway because sleep is a passive process, is a different orientation than creating trust. One is going to leave you spinning your wheels, and the other is going to open the door back into that knowingness. And I really want to do a podcast on just this one concept someday, because it's such an eye-opening aha once you realize how often we do this for a lot of things in life. It's so easy to make the switch with the conscious intention of creating what you do want while unconsciously focusing on what you don't, simply because it's the orientation that we become so accustomed to. And this is where I see a lot of people get stuck with insomnia, because they're in the orientation of fixing. Watching videos and scrolling Instagram can be helpful, but they're only part of the equation. You also need to apply what you're learning into everyday life. And without some guidance in that process, our minds can get very creative in terms of finding ways to control sleep and stay in the orientation of the problem. So shifting the focus from fixing sleep to creating trust and living life is some of the work we do in the mentorship. And this comes from implementing the pillars of self-kindness, mindfulness, and acceptance into our daily lives. These all bring trust into what is otherwise a fearful state, which helps rewire the brain towards safety around sleep. Another way that reconnection starts to emerge is through a series of perspective shifts over time. It's very normal when you're going through insomnia to have to hear things over and over, because we become so identified with insomnia that it's hard to consider another perspective. But I've laid out my approach so that there are bite-sized teachings along the way, and that makes it easier to start shifting those unconscious beliefs about sleep. So the last thing I'd like to talk about today is the role of trust in terms of insomnia recovery. Now, a lot of people think that sleep is the solution to insomnia. But this isn't really true, because I've worked with a lot of people who are sleeping well, but still have a fear of not sleeping. They're still not living life the way they really want to live it because they're protecting sleep. So then the logic might become, well, recovery is really about the absence of fear. But this also isn't true, because I had fear showing up long after I was sleeping well. Insomnia recovery, the way I see it, isn't about sleep. And it isn't about the absence of fear. It's about the presence of trust. And you can hold these two things simultaneously. I was on a trip recently and I was sleeping in different beds every night, and I felt those old fears kick in. And I thought, oh, well, this is, really interesting because they haven't shown up for quite a while. But what trumped those fears was trust. I have developed a deep trust in my body's own ability to sleep, and those fears just don't affect me anymore. My belief in my own biology has become greater than my belief in my fear. Insomnia for me, on a much more spiritual scale, became the vessel for a deeper state of trust with the world, myself, and my own body. And that was definitely one of the silver linings of insomnia. I'd like to leave you today with a quote I stumbled on by Jeff Foster, literally right before I recorded this episode, because it's so relevant to the conversation. He says, "True healing is not the fixing of the broken, but the rediscovery of the unbroken." Thanks for joining me today. I'm Beth Kendall, and this is the Mind, Body, Sleep podcast. I'll see you next time. Thanks for being here today. If you love what you heard on today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the podcast. And if you need more support with your sleep, join me in the Mind, Body, Sleep Mentorship. This 3-month one-on-one program will transform your relationship with sleep so you can get back to living the life that you love, free from the fear of not sleeping. Head on over to bethkendall.com for more details. I'll see you next time.